We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Rick Senich. Author Jesse Fink is our guest to talk about the updated edition of his book, Bon, the Last Highway, the untold story of Bon Scott and AC/DC's Back in Black. The original edition came out in 2017. It was number one in Sweden, the UK, France. It was chosen for 5 Book of the Year lists. This new edition features a brand new 16-page introduction. This is an affectionate, honest tribute, now updated with new revelations about the rock and roll icon who helped make AC/DC an international sensation. Fink examines new information from French media that changes what we know about who was with Bon Scott the night he died on February 19th, 1980. With unprecedented access to Bon's lovers and newly unearthed documents, this updated edition contains a new introduction and more revelations about the singer's death, dispelling once and for all the idea that Scott succumbed to acute alcohol poisoning. Meticulously researched and packed with fresh information, Bon, the Last Highway is an affectionate, honest tribute to a titan of rock music. Jesse Fink was born in London, raised and educated in Sydney, Australia. He's the author of 5 books, including 2 internationally best-selling biographies, the aforementioned Bon, the Last Highway, and The Youngs, the brothers who built AC/DC. To hear a playlist of AC/DC, including the songs discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Now, onto our interview with Jesse Fink. Jesse, so great to have you on. Thanks for being here.
No problem, mate. Glad to be here.
The original edition of this book from 2017, widely considered the definitive biography of Bon Scott, number one in Sweden, the UK, and France, chosen for 5 Book of the Year lists. When that edition was completed, did you feel there were still some questions yet to be answered, or did you think at the time, this is it, there can't be any more to add, and this new stuff just came along by surprise?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I'd done pretty much all I could humanly do up to that point. And I guess the only question that remained was who sold or who gave Bon Scott the heroin that I believe killed him. And that question really remains to this day. I have my own sort of ideas about that. But what happened was that the book was released, in various countries, and I would get a lot of letters and emails, messages from people who had read the book, who had either known Bon or known people who knew Bon, or just simply had their own theories about what happened after reading what I had written in the book, and thought to get in touch with me and sort of just let me know how they were thinking or what they could contribute, which was really interesting, because it's always great when other people sort of chime in, because you see things in a different way, you get new information, and it helps. I never wanted this whole project of mine to sort of just be a lone wolf sort of thing. I wanted it to be a collaborative process where we all got together and kind of tried to solve this mystery. And what happened was that a French guy called Patrick Beaumont started emailing me these very long sort of messages, and I thought, oh, here's another crazy to deal with. But the actual sort of content of his emails was quite compelling, because what he was doing was he was sending me French language interviews that Bon had done in the 70s that I wasn't aware of, which essentially kind of backed up what I'd said in the original book, which was that he wanted to leave AC/DC. But he also sent me material related to Bon's death, and he sent me some information essentially that suggests that rather than 2 other people being with Bon back in East Dulwich the morning he died, that there were in fact other people there as well. And I think when you really think about that, you go back to the original comment from Alistair Kennedy, which was that he left Bon in the car because he couldn't carry him up to the flat, right? That was essentially the story, was that, he left Bon with the blanket in the car, and then he came out the next day and found him dead, right? And, it was a cold night and Bon had perished, in the car while Alistair was asleep in his flat. Now, if there was more than one person with Bon back in East Dulwich, there were, possibly 3 people, possibly 4 people. Why couldn't they carry him up to the flat? We might have had a completely different outcome. So I think that's a significant sort of piece of information, and I think readers will read this new introduction to the book and certainly be asking questions of, the official version of the story.
How often do you get the crazy people emailing you? I mean, what type of process do you have to go through to make sure that these people are legit?
I get crazies every single day. Every single day. Mostly with completely useless information, or they just want to abuse me or whatever, for daring to write this book. It still goes on. But like any sort of useful information, when you come across it, you have to verify it in some way. So if they're sending you translations of things, you don't rely on their translation, you do your own, or you get, original copies of the articles, or you determine what the bona fides are of the, the original journalists who wrote the articles, and find out what happened to them. And if they can be contacted, contact them. So there's all this sort of behind the scenes sort of stuff that you have to do. And, I was just saying to someone the other day that, my books are very well researched. They have a great deal of a bibliography and notes at the end of every book. And that's because I do the research. And what people don't seem to understand a lot of the time is that you can labour over a footnote in your book, and it might take you a day just to, check that out. I mean, it takes a long time. It's a very, very drawn out, involved process, and it takes years and years and years to do properly.
Before I ask you more about the book and the new information that you've discovered regarding Bon Scott, I'm curious as to when you became a fan of AC/DC, because we all have our story of that moment we become a fan of a band. What's your story?
I was going through a personal crisis, really. I had gone through a tough divorce from the mother of my child, and there was just one night where I felt like ending it all. It was 3 a.m. I was miserable. I was sorting black socks on the end of my bed, and I wanted to go out and sort of walk in front of a garbage truck. And instead, I just put on some AC/DC at the right time. And it just happened to be Power Age. It was the song Give Me a Bullet, and it just lifted me up. It was the world's greatest antidepressant. And the next day I felt really good and sort of went for a jog and went to Back in Black and Highway to Hell and Power Age, and ended up finding that the music itself was the thing that sort of lifted me out of this sort of black hole that I was in. And I then went to my publisher in Sydney, Penguin, and just said, look, has anyone ever done a book about the Young brothers? Initially, my idea was just Malcolm and Angus, and my publisher, Alison Urquhart, she said, why not include George as well? So I then wrote a book called The Youngs about sort of 11 songs of AC/DC, Stevie Wright and the Easy Beats that I thought were kind of important to the story of AC/DC, and really kind of wanted to tell AC/DC's story through these 11 songs. And it was really a tribute to them kind of saving my life that night. In the course of doing that, I also went down a real rabbit hole, I guess, with the business story of AC/DC, and sort of got into that side of things, and then discovered that AC/DC as a business is they're fairly ruthless, but that's why they're successful. That's why they're the biggest band in the world. The whole story of the brand, of the logo, and the power of the brand, and why do they sell more T-shirts than anyone else? Why can you end up in some far-flung corner of the globe, walk down a dusty street and see some kid in an AC/DC T-shirt? Why does that happen? There's a story there. And I think it's the same reason that I connected to their music that night. It's just that rock in its simplest, most primal form is an incredible thing. And so that's just what I wanted to celebrate in that book. And then that book was successful. It went around the world, and my publisher was interested, obviously, in a sequel, and I suggested we do something on Bon Scott, but this time it was more of a traditional biography.
It was initially going to be just a straight biography and not so much focused on his death. Did that just kind of happen?
Well, I mean, it's all pretty organic. When I first thought of the concept of the book, I really wanted to focus on, the journey from the first American concert in Austin in 1977 through to the last American concert in Ohio at the end of 1979. Because my hypothesis was, and this gets back to the title of the book, The Last Highway, that the road to Bon's death really began with those American tours, right? Because you can actually sort of visually see the deterioration of Bon Scott from 1977 through to 1979 in America. In 1978, he was this, supremely fit, cut, Adonis-like sort of figure. And by the end of 1979, he was puffy, he looked, haggard, he was pale, he was looking like a wreck. And it was only a few short months in London and he was dead. So I thought that there was a story there that hadn't been told. And prior to my book, really there's only one serious sort of biography of Bon Scott, and that is Clinton Walker's Highway to Hell. And the whole sort of American section of Bon's story was really only a chapter in that book. So I thought, well, there is a whole book there in itself, and so that's what I set out to do was to plot the the American journey of the band and find out what was going on the road with Bon, what his relationships were like, what was happening, vis-a-vis, alcohol, drugs, and, the story kind of wrote itself. But when I finished, I felt like it was incomplete. And I felt like, I have to tackle the death. It's something that I can't just sort of, put aside and pretend isn't there because it's the elephant in the room. And unfortunately, it ended up sort of taking 2 years on its own just to sort of work through the last 24 hours of Bon's life in London.
For those not super familiar with Bon's backstory, can you give the listeners just a brief bio of Bon, where he's from, how he ultimately lands the gig as frontman for AC/DC? There's a great story. He was the band's roadie at one point, I believe, and then got the gig as frontman.
Oh, there's a lot of, apocryphal tales about Bon Scott and AC/DC, and sorting through those and determining what's true and what's false is part of the challenge with writing AC/DC history, because I think they just told so many tall tales in the course of their early career that things that were wildly embellished have just sort of become accepted as facts. Like the whole story around Whole Lotta Rosie, which was just completely exaggerated. But Bon was born in Scotland, came out to Australia when he was young with his brothers and mother and father, lived in Western Australia, joined a band. Well, he joined a band called the Spectres and then the Valentines, which was like a bubblegum band. He was kind of like the sort of second singer in that band, and then joined a hippie band, sort of like an Australian version of the band called Fraternity, which I don't think many Americans are familiar with. And they had high hopes of making it big, but they never got to America. They ended up in England, and sort of the band tanked completely. And then Bon was quite listless and sort of not sure whether really had any career in music at all. And the thing was that a band called AC/DC, this was around 1974, were pretty unhappy with their lead singer Dave Evans, and they were passing through South Australia where Bon was living at the time, and he was asked to audition for the band one night, and suitably impressed the young brothers. And basically, Dave Evans got his marching orders, and that was it. I mean, he was in the band, and so he took over like at the end of '74. The band had only been in existence essentially since December 1973, and he was with the band right through until February 1980. So it wasn't a hell of a long time. And when you think about it, the quality of the work, the quality of the songs that he wrote during that period is just profoundly impressive.
And there are a couple interesting notes on that. The early days, there is, I believe, on YouTube, a clip of Bon with Fraternity, I think. Is that the band he was with at the time? And it's almost hard to even recognize him. At first, vocally, he's singing different, and he looks different. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is there was a single with Dave Evans, wasn't there, with AC/DC? They put out a song?
Yeah, Can I Sit Next to You, Girl?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone can see, watching the video, it's a totally different kind of band. It's a glam band, really.
Yeah, like a T-Rex type of deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Slade. AC/DC wasn't really sort of settled, visually and musically at that point. And I think Bon brought all the right sort of elements together, and then they sort of, they had an identity and they knew what they wanted to do, and they had their sound, and it just all happened.
There are some great Bon Scott stories told over the years, but like you say, not all may be necessarily true. There's one about him walking around town with a boa constrictor over his shoulders. That's a true, that's a classic. I love that one. But there was also, he was kind to friends and fans. There's a story that it was a Christmas card he sent to a friend, and then it was like a month after he passed away, that card arrived in the mail.
Yeah. Yes, Bon was a well-known card writer and would send off, hundreds of cards. And after the book came out, I was contacted by a guy called Troy Ross, who was in a band in the United States that I believe had supported AC/DC, perhaps on one of their shows. Anyway, Bon had become quite friendly with him, and Troy still actually had his Christmas card from Bon Scott, which Bon had sent, just before his death, just saying hi to Troy and wishing him and his family a very happy Christmas. And it was such a touching thing, but it was so sort of tragic and poignant, sort of seeing this card sort of, just months, before, Bon had died. But, it was amazing that Troy had held on to it. And because so many of, Bon's letters and cards have been lost. Silver Smith, who was his girlfriend for much of the late 70s, she told me that she had, 800, 900 letters from Bon, and they were all, they disappeared because someone stole a trunk in her apartment. And, it's amazing to think what might have been in there and how valuable that would have been to anyone writing a history of AC/DC.
There was an article I think Rolling Stone wrote about some of his letters that went up for auction or something. Am I getting that right? That was a few years back?
Yeah, you're right. And his wife, his ex-wife, Irene, has sold some letters. Other people have sold letters. Various sort of girlfriends who've received letters have sold letters. They're actually quite valuable in the auction market. And, I do get messages from people around the world all the time saying, can you verify this Bon signature on my card or piece of paper or album or whatever it is? And the fact of the matter is there are a lot of fakes out there. There are a lot of fakes. And so I think anyone sort of who's looking to, buy a Bon signature online or going through eBay or whatever, I would be very cautious about it.
We're talking with Jesse Fink, author of Bon, The Last Highway, the untold story of Bon Scott, and AC/DC's Back in Black. The updated edition comes out this Tuesday, May 31st, through ECW Press. One of the things that you mentioned that surprised me is that Bon was thinking about leaving AC/DC.
Yes, he was. This was told to me by a gentleman called Roy Allen from Texas that's featured in the book. Bon was struggling with his alcoholism, wanted to dry out, found that the pressure of being on the road, the loneliness of being on the road, was having a very deleterious kind of toll on his health and general well-being, and wanted to essentially take a break from it permanently and do something else with his life. And this is the interesting thing, is that, this French guy who contacted me after the first book came out sent me an article, which was an interview with Bon from a French magazine in late 79, where Bon essentially said the same thing, that he, wanted to try something new, wanted to take a break, wanted to go fishing, and, the band, could find another singer and sort of continue on without him. And this has also been corroborated by one of his ex-bandmates in fraternity, who said Bon, was talking about leaving the band. So when the first book came out, I copped a lot of abuse from people for daring to even suggest that Bon would want to leave AC/DC. But, Bon was a chameleon. He wasn't someone who was born just to be in AC/DC. He did other things with his life, and he obviously sort of wanted to do different things in his life. I think he was kind of like a bit of a, David Lee Roth sort of figure, someone who you can't sort of, pin down. I think had Bon lived beyond 1980, you got to remember that, the MTV era was only, a few years away. I think Bon would have ended up sort of doing California Girls style videos like David Lee Roth. He was a bigger than life personality.
He was an artist. Artists, a lot of times, they feel stifled. They feel like they got to break loose and do something on their own.
Yeah, he was a clever guy, but that's the thing. You go back and look at his songs and how clever they were and funny. And that's, number one is Bon was a very funny person. But he was a bit of a dark drunk. So there were all, sort of different sides to his personality, like there are so many charismatic people in the world that, you can't expect that a fascinating person, doesn't have, sort of different shades. And Bon certainly had many different shades.
Songwriting-wise, I'm not sure. I think it was really Malcolm and Angus doing the bulk of the songwriting, and then he came in to write lyrics?
Oh, well, so they were certainly, writing the music, but, Bon was, involved in certainly doing the lyrics and the melody.
Okay.
And that's why I think, so many people, they listen to Back in Black and they hear a song like You Shook Me All Night Long, and instantly it's kind of just comes across like a Bon Scott song. It just has the feel, the rhythm, the cadence, the swing of a Bon Scott song. And then that same kind of, rhythm seems to almost evaporate instantly in the follow-up album, For Those About to Rock. Why did that sort of style of songwriting sort of disappear after the Back in Black album? And I think it sort of goes back to, this whole idea of Bon having something to do with the lyrics on Back in Black. What Silver Smith told me was that Bon would write songs, where he would attempt to sort of do something a little bit clever or, whatever, and use a word that, would be picked up by the Young Brothers and basically removed, or, through their so-called editing process. So he would try and get things through, this editorial committee in AC/DC, and often it just wouldn't pass, and it would get dumbed down a bit. Some credit to the Youngs too, because what they're doing is they're in the business of rock and roll. It shouldn't be too complicated. It shouldn't be too clever, too intellectual or anything. But I think Bon was frustrated because he was listening to different kinds of music away from AC/DC. Certainly, he was into Steely Dan, for God's sake. I think that is a very clear indication where his interest lay and what he was hoping to do with his own sort of creative projects outside of the band.
Did his battles with drugs start around that time?
Well, I mean, the fact is that, Bon had a heroin overdose as far back as 1975 in Australia. He was, his nickname was Ronnie Road Tests because he would just, try any drug that was shoved in front of him. And there was a talk of another heroin overdose in Michael Browning's autobiography. Michael Browning was the manager of AC/DC before Peter Mensch and Lever Krebs came along. So there were two sort of reported heroin overdoses in Bond's life, even before this, I suspect, third one, which was fatal. And Bond was well known for taking drugs. He was taking a ton of Quaaludes in Miami when he was there. He'd do cocaine, you name it, and then sort of ended up sort of in the heroin scene in London in early 1980, where basically all the notable sort of rock musicians of the era were deep in the sort of the brown heroin scene, snorting heroin. So this whole sort of narrative of, Bond was just a drinker, which gets perpetuated most recently in this Australian story documentary that aired in Australia, which is up on YouTube for anyone who's overseas. Basically, the story they tell in that program is that Bond's problem was that he got bored, and when he got bored, he would drink. No, when he got bored, he would take drugs. Like so many rock musicians of that era, and
To that point, that's why was it such a big deal to have that narrative as he was just a drinker? Like I understand it's not something to be proud of that you did drugs, but at the same time, it's rock and roll, and I don't. It's not like we would think less of Bond.
Some people do, and this is the thing. It's like I just get the most vicious trolling and abuse, and I do get it pretty much daily from AC/DC fans who have just sort of latched onto this myth that the only problem that Bond had was his drinking. I mean, I was just saying to someone the other day, God, in the course of writing Bond, The Last Highway, I went to visit Mick Jones from Foreigner. Mick Jones from Foreigner is not exactly the person you sort of consider, an out of control sort of rock and roll star, but he had his own problem with drugs in the late 70s, to the point where he had to go down to the Caribbean, at Eric Clapton's joint and clean himself up. We're talking about Bon Scott of AC/DC here, the hard-living, never say die kind of lead singer of AC/DC. It's just preposterous to think that, his only vice was alcohol.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
And I guess, I'm missing. I wouldn't think any less of him. He's just no. There are plenty of rock stars who died of overdoses that we all. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I mean,
there's so many. But,
nobody says, "Oh, well, he was just a junkie or whatever." I don't know, but yeah.
Yes, but the thing with heroin, when you talk about heroin, is that there are a group of people who, when they hear that word, they immediately think junkie in a dark alleyway with a needle stuck in their arm.
Yeah.
And that's the image that they have of someone doing heroin. But the thing was, heroin was a drug of choice for some, fairly kind of, well-to-do people in London at that time. The heroin was coming in from Iran, and it was cheap, and people were having a great time on this, brown heroin.
But as far as I know, from what I read over the years, he would always show up on time for shows, and he was always on his game for the most part. It didn't affect. Towards the end, they were concerned about that, I think, but he was able to show up for the gigs, and there didn't seem. Because you write about in your book, there's one instance where somebody was saying he would lean against the drum kit just to make sure he's standing, but having said that, still, he would nail it every time.
Well, as far as I could gather, there was only really sort of one occasion where, a show that AC/DC performed was sort of derailed by his drinking, certainly. When that was one show in, I think it was Warwick in Rhode Island, I think. Yeah, it was definitely in Rhode Island. And I've actually been contacted by people who were there who remembered it and said, basically the show had to end because, Bond was completely out of it. But generally, he was well known for being able to go out on the town, sort of, take whatever he took, and then sort of get up in the morning, well dressed, very neat, turn up at the hotel lobby on time, and do it all again. When you think about AC/DC's schedule over those years, I mean, they played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of concerts, and they crossed a lot of America in the course of those tours, and there were only probably less than a dozen states that they didn't visit. They pretty much went all over America, and that has to have its toll on you.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast at gmail.com. Getting to the truth regarding Bond's final days and his death, which was on February 19th, 1980, is not an easy task. Someone once told you that the secrecy around AC/DC is, quote, worse than the CIA, worse than the Church of Scientology. You say the band's drummer, Phil Rudd, agreed to do an interview for the book, but then he backed out last minute. You still wonder why he did that, and you still don't know who was it that told him to cancel?
Well, this was around the time when Phil Rudd was having his legal troubles in New Zealand. It was quite a big story at the time, actually.
It got out there, yeah. All made headlines all over the classic rock.
All over the world, yeah. And but the interesting thing for me was the sort of behaviour of the other members of the band. Brian Johnson and Angus Young essentially hung Phil Rudd out to dry. They went on the Howard Stern show. They kind of took the piss out of him. And it really wasn't kind of the behaviour of people that you would expect would be rallying around their mate in his hour of need. It was kind of a bit cruel, actually, I thought. I'm not saying that, what Phil Rudd was doing was necessarily admirable or, it was good behaviour or anything like that. But he was clearly, obviously, not in a good way, and probably required some care and a bit of patience from his bandmates. And instead, these guys were sort of making jokes about him, very publicly. And so Phil, I think at that point, didn't really know what his future was in AC/DC. Certainly, he didn't have any contact with Angus Young. He was saying he said he hadn't even spoken to him, and this guy's the bloody drummer in AC/DC, for God's sake. And he can't get on the phone to the the lead guitarist of the biggest rock band in the world. So Phil Rudd, I think, was kind of stressed out and not sure what the future held, and he had agreed to do an interview about Bon Scott, and I'd set it up through his lawyer in New Zealand, and Phil got on the phone and we had a brief chat and we were talking, and he answered a couple of questions about Bon, and then he kind of just sort of did this complete sort of U-turn. Said, I can't do this, got to go, all too much, and hung up the phone. So, a lot of people say to me, oh, you've never spoken to a band member of AC/DC. Well, I have. It's just that, I think there's a bit of a cone of silence around certain issues in the AC/DC backstory, such as the death of Bond and the genesis of the Back in Black album, and Bond's possible involvement in the lyric writing to that album.
Nowadays, it's harder to keep a secret. Like with Malcolm, when his health was failing, it got out there. Sadly, he passed from dementia, but they do try to keep things secret. Very, very, very. And I actually passed Malcolm in the street by accident one day. Yeah, it's in the book, right? 2014. Was that?
Yeah, it was like really bizarre. I mean, 'cause I've just written a book about this guy, and he's walking towards me. Of course, my first sort of inclination is to extend my hand and shake his hand and say, "Hey, I'm Jesse Fink. I just wrote a book about you. I just wanted to say, thank you so much for, your music and, inspiring me." But he had dementia at the time. He was walking with his carer. I didn't feel like it was appropriate. And I also was cognizant that there is a whole element of people within the AC/DC fan community who would sort of think that I would be taking advantage of him in that situation. So I basically just kept walking, which was a very weird feeling, but I think it was the right thing to do. It just wasn't, for me and him and for the sake of the books, it was just like, okay, I'll just keep my distance and just keep walking. But it was kind of sad actually, because I just, wanted to say thanks.
A lot of people forget, they think Angus is the guy. If you're just the average fan, you don't know a lot about AC/DC, but Malcolm came up with some killer riffs, some of the best riffs in rock history. I mean, I think was Back in Black his?
Well, there's various stories about who came up with that, but Ross Young, Malcolm's son, actually, I was in a pub in Sydney and a young guy came over to me and said, head out the back of the pub. Ross Young wants to see you. I was like, it was kind of like shitting myself because it's Malcolm Young's son. Ross was very nice to me. He said, that he wanted to say hello. He said, I said, has the family seen the book? And he said, yeah, my mother's read it, and he said that Malcolm had read it or seen it, and that they approved that there was no issues, that they liked it. And I remember actually I posted a photo of me and Ross at this meeting in the pub, on social media, and basically relating what I just said to you, that they'd seen the book and liked it and had no problem with it. And so many people, sort of these crazy AC/DC fans, kind of said that I'd made it all up, that there was no possible way in the world that Malcolm and his wife had read it and liked it, and that I'd basically fabricated the whole thing, which is ridiculous. I mean, why would I go and do something like that? But this is what what you deal with these crazy one-eyed fans, and AC/DC has some very peculiar, hardcore fans, and I've literally had death threats from some of these people. I mean,
really?
They're just nuts.
Wow,
yeah, but,
man.
No, yeah, I mean, to the point where we went to the FBI about it. So because I was getting threats from this lunatic, I think it was in Illinois or something, and he was just blowing up my Facebook, Messenger inbox, and just crazy abuse, like mad. And so I've been dealing with that a lot since the book came out 5 years ago.
Well, the band never tried to take any legal action against you.
No.
So,
but how could they? Because it was written in such a way that I'm dealing in facts. I present the information in such a way that I let readers kind of make up their own mind about what is the most likely scenario in Bond's death, and certainly with the lyrics issue, and leave it up to them to sort of determine what's most likely true. I'm not definitively saying this is 100% happened, because I can't, because particularly sort of with Bond's death, that was, what year is it? Is it 2022? I mean, it was 42 years ago, right? Where Bond was supposedly discovered in the back of his car. The police investigation probably was wrapped up within 24 to 48 hours. It wasn't much of a police investigation if I could go and find someone else who was also there who admits to me that she was there. Why aren't the police picking this up 42 years ago? So I think I've actually done some pretty valuable work sort of in regards doing what the police should have done 4 decades ago.
Makes me think of the Kurt Cobain story. Kurt Cobain, the same thing. The police were like, just some junkie, so whatever. He killed himself. We're not going to do any investigating here. It's over.
Exactly, but the thing is, for the coroner to do his work properly, the coroner kind of needs as much relevant information about the circumstances around someone's death, such as who they were with, such as what they were consuming, where they were, for instance, all these things. And the thing was that, Alistair Kennedy took Bond to the hospital many, 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 many hours after Bond had died, that he was left in that car for quite a deal of time. the question is, when did Alistair know that Bond was dead? Was Bond actually just left in the car dead? There are all sorts of scenarios.
What comes to mind with me is, I'm sure many think this, if there is ever a reason to set it up to look that way and go with this story that he drank too much, died in his car, is that there are people that would have to deal with some serious legal repercussions. Like there's a story out now, there was a rapper, Mac Miller, who died. He's only 28, overdosed, and they just put the guy who gave him the drugs, put him away for 17 and a half years. So,
yeah, of course.
And that was the rumor with Jim Morrison too, same type of thing. It's like, well, if Jim Morrison died in that club there in Paris and somebody gave him the drugs, well, they're going after that person who gave him the drugs.
Exactly.
So we got to get the hell out of here, put him somewhere alone so nobody knows what really happened. And it was just one of those death by, what do they say, death by misadventure?
Misadventure, exactly. And that, I think, is what you've just said is a pretty good summation of most likely, or quite possibly, what happened that night. And the thing is, all I wanted to do while investigating Bond's death was just put together the most thorough collection of kind of facts and information around his death that was possible to do, because I felt like time was running out and it was important for me and incumbent upon me to kind of do that. And so, I managed to not only get an admission from Zena Kekuli that she was with Alistair Kinnear and Bon Scott back at, Alistair's flat in East Dulwich, but I also spoke to Zena's sister, Kula Kekuli, who has since died, who told me, I saw Bond with my own eyes. I was an ex-heroin user. I am an ex-heroin user. I'm talking about Kula here, talking about herself, not me. Kula saying, as an ex-heroin user, I saw Bond that night and he looked out of it on heroin. He was stoned. As one heroin user, I can recognize another heroin user. That's what she was saying to me. And Zena thought, Bond had taken heroin too. So they're two valuable kind of eyewitness accounts of Bond from that night. And basically there's nothing else to go on with. If you don't have any sort of other, physical evidence, what do? You go to the eyewitnesses who saw him. And so why has it taken 40 years for this admission from Zena Kekuli to come out? I mean, it should have been in the original police report.
Let's go back to that night then. You mentioned Alistair Kinnear a few times. Let's get to that night and some of the people involved. You mentioned some names here, but Alistair Kinnear, how does he become part of Bond's tragic final night? Is he even a real person?
Yeah, well, he's definitely a real person.
Okay, because there was questions regarding that. You talk about that in the book, right? Some people question whether he existed or not, or
well, Clinton Walker basically suggested that he wasn't a real person, so he got that wrong, and it was a fairly major error. No, Alistair Kinnear was actually a rock musician himself in London, who had been in a band called Screw, and he was a guitarist, and apparently he was a very talented guitarist, and he was a bit of a multi-instrumentalist, but he was very sort of plugged into the London drug scene. He was a good friend of Silver Smith, who was Bond's muse and sometime girlfriend. Bond had a fairly kind of complicated relationship with Silver, and Silver essentially rejected Bond, and Bond didn't handle it very well. Alistair and Bond had actually met, I think, at Silver's flat long before, Bond hooked up with Alistair that night. It wasn't like sort of Alistair was just like this random person who came into Bond's life that night, which has sort of been the suggestion, or certainly the inference from various stories, that, it was just like a random accident. No, those two knew each other and they were together that night for a reason. And certainly it was put to me, by people who were in London at that time that Alistair was a well-known heroin dealer, and he was known for, high-grade smack. You then have this whole other element of Pete Way and Paul Chapman from UFO, who had their own story about, what happened with Bond that night. And the thing was that Way's and Chapman's stories came out in about 2005. It was around the 25th anniversary of the death of Bond. I think it was in Classic Rock magazine. And, to cut a long story short, the most interesting thing about what Chapman was saying was that Bond had been with Chapman and another person back at Chapman's flat, and that Bond had gone off to score some heroin and was going to come back to Chapman's flat, right? And this was the night before, Bond was found in the car. So Bond never returned to Chapman's flat, right? And Chapman, who was the guitarist in UFO, told me that he basically woke up on the morning of the 19th of February 1980 and he got a phone call saying Bond was dead, right? So this is in the morning of the 19th. I think it was, could have been, he basically said as the sun was coming up, filtering into the room, he couldn't place exactly what time it was, but it was certainly before noon. And the thing is, it's a completely different story to the story told by Alistair Kennedy when he made a statement about Bond's death, which was that Bond's body was discovered in the evening of the 19th. That he came down to the car on the evening of that day and found Bond's body in the car. So how is Paul Chapman getting a phone call about Bond being dead on the morning of the 19th when Alistair only discovered his body in the evening? All right. So there's this whole discrepancy there that Clinton Walker, when he did an update to his book, I think it was in 2015, didn't even mention it at all. It wasn't even tackled. He didn't even attempt to kind of, sort of deal with this major discrepancy. And I think it's fairly significant. I mean, we're talking about the guitarist of UFO here, And so I spoke to Paul Chapman on the phone, and we got on very well, and he was very lucid and very kind of an intelligent guy. He wasn't like this sort of strung out smacky or anything like that, and nor was Pete Way. Both those guys took a lot of drugs in their day, but they were intelligent, lucid people. They remembered as much as they could. I took their information and then started sort of putting it all together with Alistair Kennedy's account, with Silver Smith's account, with Joe Fury's account. Joe Fury was a friend of Silver Smith and Bond. According to Silver Smith, Silver said she got a phone call from Bond who said that I have finished the lyrics for the album, right? I've finished what I set out to do. We're obviously talking about the Back in Black album here. Silver, let's go out and celebrate. I finished writing all the lyrics, right? She said, I want to stay in. Why don't you hook up with Alistair? So he hooks up with Alistair. He goes to the Music Machine in London.
That's a club.
Which is a club. There's a band called Lonesome No More playing at the club. I speak to Billy Duffy, who obviously is the guitarist in the Cult, who was there in the bar that night. He said he saw Bond walk into the bar and go backstage. And Lonesome No More is managed by Zena Kukuli, right? Kula Kukuli is the lead singer of Lonesome No More. Both those women think that Bond took heroin that night. We then know that he leaves the club, I think at around, it was like 1, 2, not exactly sure, but, after midnight. Goes into a car with Alistair Kennedy. According to the conventional story, it's just Alistair Kennedy and Bond in this car. There's talk that, they went to Bond's flat Alistair tried to, get him up to his flat, but couldn't. So decides that he's going to drive Bond to his own place back in East Dulwich, which is further out from Bond's flat, which is in Westminster, in the centre of London. And he ends up in East Dulwich, can't get him up the stairs to his own flat, so basically puts a blanket on him and leaves him in the car, and then comes out the next day having, slept half a day. It's early evening and finds Bond's body in the car. Suddenly decides, I've got to drive him to the hospital, goes to the hospital, and the hospital staff take Bond's body out of the car, and, Alistair drives off. That's the conventional sort of story.
I'm looking at the picture of that apartment too. It's just a tiny little apartment complex, Overhill Road.
The thing is, if you look at the block of flats and where the car would have been parked, it's quite a busy street. So if you actually look at that street on Google Maps or Google Earth, and you scroll around, there's a big sort of housing development, right over the road. So there are people, quite a number of people living in that area. So the idea that a sort of a dead body could have been in the car for the better part of a day, in daylight hours without anyone noticing, is rather odd.
Yeah, you're right. There's a huge apartment complex right across the street.
Yeah,
with a bunch of apartments in there. Narrow.
So we're led to believe that no one walked past that parked car with a dead body in the back of it for an entire day.
Right, like you said, it's not like an isolated area.
It's not an isolated area. So there would have been a lot of foot traffic past that car, right? So I get an admission from Zena Kukuli that she was also there, right? Then Patrick Beaumont, who's this French reader who read the French edition of my book, says, do you know about this interview that Peter Parrott did in 2009 with French media where he says he was also there, which is odd because when I spoke to Zena, Peter Parrott being the husband of Zena, when I spoke to Zena, she said that she was the only other person with Bond and Alistair. So why would Peter Parrott also be there? So naturally, I went back to Zena through the same communication channels I had contacted her the first time and said, I want to ask you more questions about this, and never heard back from Zena at all. Wow. So it's a very odd story, and then you marry it with the whole story about Paul Chapman and how he said that Bond was going off to score some smack, come back to his apartment. When Pete Way got a phone call about it, about Bond being dead, everything. When you put it all together, some things don't kind of add up, and so that's why it ended up taking sort of 2 years of my life to come together with what I thought was a sort of a reasonable kind of narrative for what happened.
Joe Fury was UFO's guitar tech at that time.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Chapman is adamant that he saw Bond the night before, the 18th, spent the late evening of the 18th with Joe Fury, waiting for Bond to show up at his flat with a supply of heroin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of pieces of this puzzle to put together. And we're talking a time when nowadays people have phones. You can take a camera and film something,
exactly.
Or take a snapshot of something back. In those days, it's different.
So I would love, one day for Netflix or HBO or, some sort of streaming network to actually turn this into a documentary, because I think it would be fascinating. It could be like another The Stairs, The Stairway. What was that doco called about the woman who falls down the stairs?
Oh, yeah.
Initially I had an approach from Columbia Pictures, actually. This was after the whole Bohemian Rhapsody success. I've had various kind of documentary producers come to me and talk about turning the book into a doco. and they all sort of have different kind of ideas about how it should be. There's obviously the issue of music licensing in a documentary, and the only way really to get around that is to do it without the music. But I think the way to do it properly would be to do a documentary solely about the last day on Earth of Bon Scott. I think it would be fascinating.
What has been AC/DC's account of Bond's death over the years? Has it ever changed?
No, they're pretty much, stuck to the official story. It's all, gets back to alcohol poisoning, and the interesting thing is, Bond's blood alcohol level was, I think it was half of Amy Winehouse, right? So Amy Winehouse died with double the alcohol in her system, and Bond also died, with half the alcohol in his system. So I just don't believe it, to be honest. I mean, Bond was a champion, seasoned drinker. There's no way that half a bottle of whiskey is going to put Bon Scott on the ground.
No, he was still fairly young, 33. Although 33, that starts to take its toll. I think people were starting to say was he throwing up blood at times? He was starting to show the wear and tear.
There's talk that he had problems with his liver, and the difficulty is there are so many sort of different stories, and some of them are true and some of them are apocryphal, and I've got to sort through all that. But the thing is, you say Bond was just 33, but he also looked 50.
Yeah.
But just look at photographs of Bond from 1979, but certainly early 1980. He looked bloody terrible.
And the band, they're at the time. They finally reached that point that they were working so hard to get to with Highway to Hell. Mutt Lange produces that album. Highway to Hell, the title track, is a huge success in the album, and they're on the verge of something huge, which ends up happening anyway. But it would have been with Bond. Now, Malcolm was the one who had to make that call to Bond's family, or was he? Conflicting reports on that as well.
Yes, I mean, from memory, I think I've heard Angus made that call. Others, that Malcolm made that call, but it was certainly one of the young brothers. And the challenge for any AC/DC biographer is that stories change over the years, and one of the biggest sort of story changes is this whole thing around the lyrics to Back in Black. I mean, there's even a couple of interviews where Angus says that some of Bond's lyrics are on the album, and then you have Malcolm Young and Brian Johnson saying Bond had prepared nothing. So you have two diametrically opposed stories, and then suddenly the story becomes Bond had absolutely nothing to do with it. But you have to actually go back to earlier interviews, from the 90s, from the 80s, 90s, a different story is told. And so that's where, solid research really pays off, because you see these discrepancies, and they become immediately noticeable. And certainly the story isn't resolved.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. So let's wind down with that, because you have alluded to that Back in Black album. You mentioned You Shook Me All Night Long, and you believe he did write some of the lyrics, including that one. Now, there was a notebook, right, that he had jotted down some lyrics. Silver Smith was the one who saw those notes, or no?
Silver said that she saw the line, "She told me to come, but I was already there," in a letter of Bond's from about 1976, right? She said that she remembered the line. Malcolm Dome, the late rock journalist, said that he saw the line, "She told me to come, but I was already there," actually in Bond's notebook. And there's a video of him on YouTube saying that. The lyrics for You Shook Me All Night Long are interesting in that I got to spend time with a woman in Miami who was Bond's girlfriend in 1979, who was introduced to me by some people that I'd met in Florida. She pretty much told me the backstory of kind of the recording of Highway to Hell, or the attempted recording of Highway to Hell in Miami with Eddie Kramer, which was aborted, and AC/DC's rehearsals in Miami. As I spent time with this woman, got to know her very well, and she, told me things that, such as the fact that her horse was called Double Time, right? Which is a word that appears in that song.
Doing double time on the seduction line.
Seduction line, right? And that's a remarkable coincidence. And I'm looking at this woman, and she's a complete hottie. In 1979, she was this sort of goddess. No wonder Bond was interested in her. Physically, she's a stunner, and the whole sort of idea of her being American thighs makes complete sense, right? And she tells me that she went out to a hotel called the Newport with Bond, and he had turned to her as they were sitting out on chairs by the pool and said, you have chartreuse eyes. And she said, that lyric was changed to sightless eyes in the song. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, chartreuse eyes, that works, but sightless eyes? Why is this woman blind? It doesn't make any sense. Sort of you go through that song and you really, I certainly personally take away the feeling that it's a Bond song all over. It just has that kind of, as I said before, that zip and rhythm and melody of a classic Bon Scott AC/DC song. And then you think that, well, the Scott family apparently gets royalties for Back in Black.
That's the other thing. Yeah. Bond's old friend revealed something to a newspaper in 2006 about this.
Yeah, Vince Lovegrove did an interview for, I think it was the West Australian newspaper back in 2005 for the 25th anniversary of Bond's death, and he got an admission from a member of the Scott family that royalties for Back in Black were coming to the Scott family. And as far as I know, that's the only time that has been reported. And, Vince Lovegrove was a very close person to Bon Scott, so he had the access to the Scott family. And so, I think that's pretty telling, and then, I've spoken to hundreds of people over the years about AC/DC, people who were connected to the band, who were producers or tour managers or engineers. And I sort of became and have been friendly with David Krebs, who was the principal of Lieber Krebs, the management company that handled Aerosmith, AC/DC, Ted Nugent. Lieber Krebs was AC/DC's management company at the time of Back in Black. David said to me, I look at the credits for that album, and I don't think that's an accurate reflection of actually what the real story is. So that's coming from a manager of AC/DC. That's pretty sort of compelling, I think.
I know Brian said when he was writing the lyrics to You Shook Me All Night Long, he went back to his room there and was at the Nassau, Bahamas, and he felt a presence in the room, like it was Bond moving the pen.
The famous ghost story. Yeah, well, I don't think the famous ghost story is particularly convincing, and I don't know any Bon Scott fan, certainly on my Facebook group, Bon Scott Forum, who believes that story at all. I just think it's a ridiculous story, and it's worth bearing in mind that prior to Back in Black, Brian Johnson, in his other band, Geordie, I think only had about 3 or 4 songwriting credits over the course of that band's career, right? He didn't actually write a single song himself where he had sole credit for a song, right? And Geordie's music's not particularly great. Yet, he gets parachuted into this band. He basically has no experience writing songs. He's in his little room in the Bahamas, and, voila, Bond's ghost appears, and suddenly Brian Johnson turns out one of the best verses in pop music history. the she told me to come, but I was already there verse, and we're expected to believe that this sort of just miraculously happened. No, I don't believe it. I mean, a song like that only gets written after you've been doing it for a long time, and you've honed your craft and you've become a master at it. Writing well is a skill that is developed and honed over a long period of time.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
I'm just
defense
not finding that argument convincing at all.
Yeah, in defense of Brian Johnson, his voice is amazing, just kick-ass vocals on that album, and he really, and he's said nothing but good things about Bon. He had the ultimate respect for him, and the story also is that Bon said to the rest of the guys, "Hey, this guy Brian Johnson, he'd be good for the band if I'm ever gone," or something to that effect.
Yeah, which to be honest, I think is a load of horseshit.
Yeah,
personally.
Okay.
I just think it's a story that's been said once and it's been repeated many times over, and suddenly it's just sort of become accepted history. Look, a lot of people, love Brian Johnson. Personally, he's not to my taste, and that's fine. I don't particularly enjoy AC/DC sort of post Back in Black. I've never really sort of found it that great. I mean, I think there are tracks on various albums that are really good, but I've never actually enjoyed an AC/DC album sort of beginning to end since 1980, really.
You know what's interesting too? I just read this recently. Brian Johnson was writing lyrics right up until The Razor's Edge, and he went to Angus and Malcolm and said, "Guys, I can't come up with anything anymore. You guys got to help me out." And then they wrote Thunderstruck, the lyrics to Thunderstruck. And
yeah, but do you believe that story? That's the issue.
I don't know what to believe anymore.
I think the most likely explanation is that the Young brothers decided they wanted all the publishing rights to themselves.
Okay.
And they just
Man,
cut him out.
I am so naive, Jesse. I'm believing all these stories. I never even thought about that. It's so true. Yeah. You got to get the publishing is so huge in the music industry. Oh man. Yeah. Isn't that's like Eddie Money had a story. He sold all his publishing to when he was alive, he said, "I sold all my publishing to my now ex-wife so I could buy her a house." And that's why he used to tour all the time. He played wherever he could play because he didn't have publishing anymore. That was according to him, but
yeah, exactly. That's where the money is.
So where do you rank Bon Scott among the greatest frontmen in rock history?
I'd put him at number one, really, to be honest. I just think because he wrote, over 50 magnificent rock songs in such a short space of time, and those songs really are the kind of the mainstay of AC/DC's live shows and have been since the 80s. They've really stood the test of time. They don't seem to age. Whenever you hear them on the radio, they instantly pick you up. They're real, pick me up songs. He was a master when it came to stagecraft. He's a fascinating person to watch, even when he's not singing.
Yes,
just the way that he moves around the stage. He was a brilliant vocalist. He had an incredible vocal range. But above all else, I think he kind of embodied really the spirit of rock and roll. And that's why there is this real sort of personality cult around Bon Scott. It's why people get tattoos of Bon Scott on their bodies, because I think he represents to a lot of people the kind of person they want to be but can't be,
And he was the real deal. He wasn't putting on a character when he went on stage.
I think there was a duality to Bon that is not immediately apparent, and that certainly was a part of what I discovered writing the book, was that I did think that he had a persona that worked for him on stage that was very different to kind of the person that he was off stage.
Okay, we talked about that kinder, sweeter side of him.
Yeah, there was all that, but there was also a bit of darkness too, and a bit more complexity. But this is the thing. Look, with anyone who's a performer, it's like you switch it on, you turn it on, you do your show for 2-3 hours, and then suddenly you get off stage and you've got to turn it off. And some people deal with that, turning off of the switch in a very healthy way, and others don't. And I don't think Bond dealt with it very healthily.
I think a lot of these guys, when they die young, if they only were able to just live through it long enough to get past it,
it's
a whole different.
And those what ifs are are questions that AC/DC fans, certainly the people who are on the Bond Scott forum talk about it every day. They they want to say, hey, what do you think Bond would be doing today if he were alive? And I think he'd probably be living in the south of France, painting or doing sculpture or, just doing something completely bloody different. And he would get together with AC/DC and do a reunion tour and make a lot of money and he'd be a very rich man.
Cool.
But he died with $30,000 in his bank account.
Really? Man. Mm. Well, that would have changed too. He would have been a millionaire in a few years. Before I forget, I want to ask you about Whole Lotta Rosie. You mentioned something about that at the top. The story was that this was a true story about Bond with some big old woman. You said that's not true? A very large woman that Bond had relations with?
She was a large woman, but her name was Rosemary Garcia, and she was from Tasmania. She was running a brothel in St Kilda in Melbourne. She was a drug user, and she died very young. Recently, I did a blog on my website about the whole backstory and kind of sorting through the truths and the half truths and the sheer lies about the origins of that story and how it's all sort of been distorted over the years. And the key thing was getting a name, and that came through a woman who contacted me on Facebook who said she had some details about Miss Garcia, and then I wrote the blog, and an American writer called Dean Goodman, who was the co-writer of Artemis Pyle from Lynyrd Skynyrd,
drummer.
The drummer. They were going to release a book together, and it got pulled essentially because there was a legal kerfuffle. Anyway, cut a long story short, Mr. Goodman's book with Artemis Pyle was never published. But anyway, Dean Goodman then went with the information that was in that blog about Rosemary Garcia and actually got a death certificate for Rosemary Garcia. And if you go to Dean Goodman's website, you'll find all the information we know about this young lady who passed away so young and so tragically.
So there's a lot more to the story than we know.
Well, it's a bit of a sad ending, really, isn't it? I mean, and the funny thing is, I was still getting messages, even weeks before, I wrote that story on Rosemary Garcia, from people in Tasmania saying, "Oh no, she's alive and well, and she's living in Tassie." There's just so much crap out there. So, but that's the job of a journalist. It's like just don't accept the first thing you hear, and do your own research. Talk to a couple of different people, and verify. That's our job. And the problem is, in this day and age, where sort of everything is online, information is just sort of accessed so quickly and kind of forgotten so quickly, is that people just don't have the same journalistic rigor that they had decades ago. People
just take the story based on the headline. That's what they
exactly.
They don't even
exactly
take the time.
And then that just gets recycled, and then suddenly it becomes an accepted truth. And this is essentially what's happened with AC/DC's history, is that all these sort of half-truths have kind of, coalesced into the truth. And that's why, anyone who's attempting to write a biography of AC/DC really has to go back through those old stories and all the sort of, wild tales that have been told over the years and actually try and determine whether they're true or not.
Bond: The Last Highway, the untold story of Bon Scott and AC/DC's Back in Black. Updated edition is out May 31st. That's this Tuesday through ECW Press. It's available wherever books are sold. And Jesse, you have a website. What's your website address?
JesseFinkBooks.com, and anyone who's on Facebook is welcome to join Bon Scott Forum, which is in Facebook groups, and we've got about 16,000 sort of Bond fans there who love to talk Bond all day.
Jesse Fink, this was awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, as always, for listening to the Booked on Rock podcast. Make sure you subscribe and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Go to bookedonrock.com for a listing of all the major platforms where you can listen to the podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.